sure to subscribe our channel and press the bell icon to get notified about our future videos. To the questions. Question 1. Your company has virtual machines hosted in Microsoft Azure. The virtual machines are located in a single Azure virtual network named VNet1. The company has users that work remotely. The remote workers require access to the virtual machines on VNet1. You need to provide access for the remote workers. What should you do? The correct option is C. Configure a point-to-site VPN. A point-to-site VPN gateway connection lets you create a secure connection to your virtual network from an individual client computer. Question 2. Your company has an Azure Active Directory subscription. You need to deploy 5 virtual machines to your company's virtual network subnet. The virtual machines will each have both a public and private IP address. Inbound and outbound security rules for all of these virtual machines must be identical. Which of the following is the least amount of security groups needed for this configuration? The correct option is D1. You will only require one security group as all the settings are the same. Question 3. Your company's Azure subscription includes Azure virtual machines that run Windows Server 2016. One of the virtual machine is backed up every day using Azure Backup Instant Restore. When the virtual machine becomes infected with data encrypting ransomware, you decide to recover the virtual machine's files. Which of the following is true in this scenario? The correct option is B. You can recover the files to any virtual machine within the company's subscription. You can restore files by mounting the backup to your own local machine if you like, just like you could on any of the virtual machines in Azure, as they are all 2016. It just uses an ISCSI connection to the backup image. You cannot restore files to an older or newer version of the OS. It must be a compatible client OS. Therefore, restoring files back to the same subscription is the best option, but it has to be the same OS version. Although answer A is possible, but restoring files back to an infected virtual machine doesn't sound right to me. Question 4. Your company's Azure subscription includes Azure virtual machines that run Windows Server 2016. One of the virtual machines is backed up every day using Azure Backup Instant Restore. When the virtual machine becomes infected with data encrypting ransomware, you are required to restore the virtual machine. Which of the following actions should you take? The correct option is C. You should restore the virtual machine to a new Azure virtual machine. About the options: A. If you delete the virtual machine, you cannot recover to that virtual machine. It must exist. About B. You do not know the other virtual machines. About C. Creating a new virtual machine, you can recover the virtual machine. About D. You can recover from the backup. Question 5. Your company has an Azure subscription that includes a recovery services vault. You want to use Azure Backup to schedule a backup of your company's virtual machines to the recovery services vault. Which of the following VMs can you backup? Choose all that apply. In this question, All of the given options are correct. About the options, Azure Backup supports backup of 64-bit Windows Server operating system from Windows Server 2008. Azure Backup supports backup of 64-bit Windows 10 operating system. Azure Backup supports backup of 64-bit Debian operating system from Debian 7.9 Plus. Azure Backup supports backup of VM that are shut down or offline. Question 6. Your company has an Azure Active Directory subscription. You need to deploy 5 virtual machines to your company's virtual network subnet. The virtual machines will each have both a public and private IP address. Inbound and outbound security rules for all of these VMs must be identical. Which of the following is the least amount of network interfaces needed for this configuration? The correct option is A. 5. 5 VMs, so 5 NIC cards. We have public and private IP address set to them. However, they need same inbound and outbound rule, so create NSG and attach to NIC. And this requirement can be fulfilled. 5 NIC, hence 5 is the right answer. Question 7. You have a Microsoft 365 tenant and an Azure Active Directory tenant named contoso.com. You plan to grant 3 users named user1, user2 and user3 access to a temporary Microsoft SharePoint document library named library1. You need to create groups for the users. The solution must ensure that the groups are deleted automatically after 180 days. Which 2 groups should you create? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. The correct options are A and C, that is, a Microsoft 365 group that uses the assigned membership type, and a Microsoft 365 group that uses the dynamic user membership type. You can set expiration policy only for Office 365 groups in Azure Active Directory. Note, with the increase in usage of Office 365 groups, administrators and users need a way to clean up unused groups. Expiration policies can help remove inactive groups from the system and make things cleaner. When a group expires, all of its associated services are also deleted. You can set up a rule for dynamic membership on security groups or Office 365 groups. Question 8. You have an Azure Active Directory tenant that contains 5,000 user accounts. You create a new user account named admin user1. You need to assign the user administrative role to admin user1. What should you do from the user account properties? The correct option is B. From the directory role blade, modify the directory role. Assign a role to a user. Sign into the Azure portal with an account that is a global admin or privileged role admin for the directory. Select Azure Active Directory, select users, and then select a specific user from the list. For the selected user, select directory role, select add role, and then pick the appropriate admin roles from the directory roles list, such as conditional access administrator. Press select to save. Question 9. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1 and an on-premises deployment of Microsoft System Center Service Manager. Subscription 1 contains a virtual machine named VM1. You need to ensure that an alert is set in Service Manager when the amount of available memory on VM1 is below 10%. What should you do first? The correct option is C. Deploy the IT Service Management Connector. The IT Service Management Connector allows you to connect Azure and a supported IT Service Management product or service such as the Microsoft System Center Service Manager. With ITSMC, you can create work items in ITSM tool based on your Azure alerts. Question 10. You have an Azure Active Directory tenant named contosocloud.onmicrosoft.com. Your company has a public DNS zone for contoso.com. You add contoso.com as a custom domain name to Azure AD. You need to ensure that Azure can verify the domain name. Which type of DNS record should you create? The correct option is AMX. To verify the custom domain name, first sign in to the Azure portal using a global administrator account for the directory. Second, select Azure Active Directory and then select custom domain name. On the Fabricam custom domain names page, select the custom domain name Contoso. And lastly, on the Contoso page, select Verify to make sure your custom domain is properly registered and is valid for Azure AD. Use either the TXT or the MX record type. Note, there are several versions of this question in the exam. The question can have two correct answers, MX and TXT. The question can also have other incorrect answer options, including the following: SRV and NSEC3. Question 11. You have the Azure virtual machines shown in the following table. You have a recovery services vault that protects VM1 and VM2. You need to protect VM3 and VM4 by using recovery services. What should you do first? The correct option is A. Create a new recovery services vault. A recovery services vault is a storage entity in Azure that houses data. The data is typically copies of data or configuration information for virtual machines, workloads, servers, or workstations. You can use recovery services vaults to hold backup data for various Azure services. Question 12. Hotspot. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1 that contains a resource group named RG1. In RG1, you create an internal load balancer named LB1 and a public load balancer named LB2. You need to ensure that an administrator named admin1 can manage LB1 and LB2. The solution must follow the principle of least privilege. Which role should you assign to admin1 for each task? To answer, select the appropriate option in the answer area. Note, each correct selection is worth 1 point. To the answer area, to add a backend pool to LB1. The correct option is network contributor on RG1. To the next statement, to add a health probe to LB2. The correct option is network contributor on RG1. Question 13. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure Active Directory tenant named contoso.com and an Azure Kubernetes Services cluster named AKS1. An administrator reports that she is unable to grant access to AKS1 to the users in contoso.com. You need to ensure that access to AKS1 can be granted to the contoso.com users. What should you do first? The correct option is B. From contoso.com, Create an OAuth 2.0 authorization endpoint. Cluster administrators can configure Kubernetes role-based access control based on a user's identity or directory group membership. Azure AD authentication is provided to AKS clusters with OpenID Connect. OpenID Connect is an identity layer built on top of the OAuth 2.0 protocol. Question 14. You have a log analytics workspace that collects data from various data sources. You create a new Azure Monitor log query. You plan to view data pinned as a chart to a shared dashboard. What is the maximum number of days for which data can be pinned as a chart on the dashboard? Select only one answer. The correct option is A14. Question 15. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1 that contains a virtual network named VNet1. VNet1 is in a resource group named RG1. Subscription 1 has a user named User1. User1 has the following roles: Reader, Security Admin, Security Reader. You need to ensure that User1 can assign the reader role for VNet1 to other users. What should you do? The correct option is B. Assign User1 the user access administrator role for VNet1. Has full access to all resources, including the right to delegate access to others. Note, there are several versions of this question in the exam. The question has two possible correct answers. Assign User1 the user access administrator role for VNet1. Assign User1 the owner role for VNet1. Question 16. You have an Azure Active Directory tenant named contoso.onmicrosoft.com that contains 100 user accounts. You purchase 10 Azure AD Premium P2 licenses for the tenant. You need to ensure that 10 users can use all the Azure AD Premium features. What should you do? The correct option is A. From the licenses blade of Azure AD, assign a license. From Active Directory to Manage section, then choose Licenses, then All Products, and select Azure Active Directory Premium P2, then assign a user to it. Question 17. Drag drop. Your company has an Azure subscription that includes a number of Azure virtual machines, which are all part of the same virtual network. Your company also has an on-premises Hyper-V server that hosts a virtual machine named VM1, which must be replicated to Azure. Which of the following objects that must be created to achieve this goal? Answer by dragging the correct option from the list to the answer area. The options provided to us are Hyper-V site, storage account, Azure Recovery Services Vault, Azure Traffic Manager Instance, Replication Policy, and Endpoint. The correct options are Hyper-V site, Azure Recovery Services Vault, and Replication Policy. Question 18. Your company has two on-premises servers named SRV01 and SRV02. Developers have created an application that runs on SRV01. The application calls a service on SRV02 by IP address. You plan to migrate the application on Azure VMs. You have configured two VMs on a single subnet in an Azure virtual network. You need to configure the two virtual machines with static internal IP addresses. What should you do? The correct option is E. Run the set-azure static VNet IP PowerShell cmdlet. Specify a static internal IP for a previously created VM. If you want to set a static IP address for a VM that you previously created, you can do so by using the following CMD lets. If you already set an IP address for the VM and you want to change it to a different IP address, you shall need to remove the existing static IP address before running these CMD lets. See the instructions below to remove a static IP. For this procedure, you shall use the update-azure VM CMD let. The update-azure VM CMD let restarts the VM as part of the update process. The DIP that you specify will be assigned after the VM restarts. In this example, we set the IP address for VM2, which is located in Cloud Service Static Demo. Get-azure VM -service name static demo -name VM2. Then set-azure static VNet IP address 192.168.4.7 update-azure VM. Question 19. You administer a solution in Azure that is currently having performance issues. You need to find the cause of this performance issues pertaining to metrics on the Azure infrastructure. Which of the following is the tool you should use? The correct option is B. Azure Monitor. Metrics in Azure Monitor are stored in a time series database which is optimized for analyzing time-stamped data. This makes metrics particularly suited for alerting and fast detection of issues. Question 20. Your company has an Azure AD tenant that is configured for hybrid coexistence with the on-premises Active Directory domain. The on-premise virtual environment consists of virtual machines running on Windows Server 2012 R2 Hyper-V host servers. You have created some PowerShell scripts to automate the configuration of newly created virtual machines. You plan to create several new virtual machines. You need a solution that ensures the scripts are run on the new VMs. Which of the following is the best solution? The correct option is A. Configure a setupcomplete.cmd batch file in the %win directory %/setup/scripts directory. After you deploy a virtual machine, you typically need to make some changes before it is ready to use. This is something you can do manually, or you could use remote PowerShell to automate the configuration of your VM after deployment, for example. But now, there is a third alternative available, allowing you to customize your virtual machine, the custom script extension. This custom script extension is executed by the VM agent and it is very straightforward. You specify which files it needs to download from your storage account and which file it needs to execute. You can even specify arguments that need to be passed to the script. The only requirement is that you execute a .ps1 file. Question 21. Your company has an Azure subscription. You need to deploy a number of Azure virtual machines using Azure Resource Manager templates. You have been informed that the virtual machines will be included in a single availability set. You are required to make sure that the ARM template you configure allows for as many VMs as possible to remain accessible in the event of fabric failure or maintenance. Which of the following is the value that you should configure for the platform update domain count property? The correct option is B20. Each virtual machine in your availability set is assigned an update domain and a fault domain by the underlying Azure platform. For a given availability set, 5 non-user configurable update domains are assigned by default to indicate groups of virtual machines and underlying physical hardware that can be rebooted at the same time. Question 22. Your company has a Microsoft Azure subscription. The company has data centers in Los Angeles and New York. You are configuring the 2 data centers as geo-clustered sites for site resiliency. You need to recommend an Azure storage Redundancy option. You have the following data storage requirements. Data must be stored on multiple nodes. Data must be stored on nodes in separate geographic locations. Data can be read from the secondary location as well as from the primary location. Which of the following Azure stored redundancy options should you recommend? The correct option is B. Read-only geo-redundant storage. RAGRS allows you to have higher read availability for your storage account by providing read-only access to the data replicated to the secondary location. Once you enable this feature, the secondary location may be used to achieve higher availability in the event the data is not available in the primary region. This is an opt-in feature which requires the storage account to be geo-replicated. Question 23. Your company has several departments. Each department has a number of VMs. The company has an Azure subscription that contains a resource group named RG1. All VMs are located in RG1. You want to associate each VM with its respective department. What should you do? The correct option is C. Assign tags to the virtual machines. The tags associate the VMs to each department. Then, for example, it can be charged to each department. Question 24. Your company has 3 VMs that are included in an availability set. You try to resize one of the VMs, which returns an allocation failure message. It is imperative that the VM is resized. Which of the following actions should you take? The correct option is C. You should stop all 3 VMs. If the VM you wish to resize is part of an availability set, then you must stop all VMs in the availability set before changing the size of any VM in the availability set. The reason all VMs in the availability set must be stopped before performing the resize operation to a size that requires different hardware is that all running VMs in the availability set must be using the same physical hardware cluster. Therefore, if a change of physical hardware cluster is required to change the VM size, then all VMs must be first stopped and then restarted one by one to a different physical hardware clusters. Question 25. You have an Azure VM that has a single data disk. You have been tasked with attaching the data disk to another Azure VM. You need to make sure that your strategy allows for the virtual machines to be offline for the least amount of time possible. Which of the following is the action you should take first? The correct option is C. Detach the data disk. You can simply detach a data disk from one VM and attach it to other VM without stopping either of the VMs. Question 26. Your company has an Azure subscription. You need to deploy a number of Azure virtual machines using Azure Resource Manager templates. You have been informed that the VMs will be included in a single availability set. You are required to make sure that the ARM template you configure allows for as many VMs as possible to remain accessible in the event of fabric failure or maintenance. Which of the following is the value that you should configure for the platform fault domain count property? The correct option is D. Max value. The number of fault domains for managed availability sets varies by region, either 2 or 3 per region. Question 27. Your company has an Azure AD tenant that is configured for hybrid coexistence with the on-premises Active Directory domain. You plan to deploy several new VMs in Azure. The VMs will have the same operating system and custom software requirements. You configure a reference VM in the on-premise virtual environment. You then generalize the VM to create an image. You need to upload the image to Azure to ensure that it is available for selection when you create the new Azure VMs. Which PowerShell cmdlets should you use? The correct option is B, add-az-vhd. The add-az-vhd cmdlet uploads on-premises virtual hard disks in .vhd file format to a blob storage account as fixed virtual hard disks. Question 28. You have an Azure subscription named AZPT1 that contains the resources shown in the following table. You create a new Azure subscription named AZPT2. You need to identify which resources can be moved to AZPT2. Which resources should you identify? The correct option is C, VM1, Storage1, VNet1, VM1 Managed, and RVault1. You can move a VM and its associated resources to a different subscription by using the Azure portal. You can now move an Azure Recovery Service Vault to either a new resource group within the current subscription or to a new subscription. Question 29. Drag drop. You have downloaded an ARM template to deploy numerous virtual machines. The ARM template is based on a current VM but must be adapted to reference an administrative password. You need to make sure that the password cannot be stored in plain text. You are preparing to create the necessary components to achieve your goal. Which of the following should you create to achieve your goal? The options provided to us are an Azure Key Vault, an Azure Storage Account, Azure Active Directory, Identity Protection, an Access Policy, an Azure Policy, a Backup Policy. The correct options are an Azure Key Vault, an Access Policy. You can use a template that allows you to deploy a simple Windows VM by retrieving the password that is stored in a key vault. Therefore, the password is never put in plain text in the template parameter file. Note, the questions from 30 to 40 are a part of a series of multiple questions that present the same scenario. Each question in the series contains a unique solution that might meet the stated goals. Some question sets might have more than one correct answer, while others might not have a correct solution. After you answer a question in this section, you will not be able to return to it. As a result, these questions will not appear in the review screen. Question 30. You have an Azure AD tenant named Adatum and an Azure subscription named Subscription1. Adatum contains a group named Developers. Subscription1 contains a resource group named Dev. You need to provide the developers group with the ability to create Azure Logic apps in the Dev resource group. On Subscription1, you assign the DevTest Labs user role to the developers group. Does this meet the goal? The correct answer is B. No. DevTest Lab user role only lets you connect, start, restart, and shut down virtual machines in your Azure DevTest Labs. The Logic App Contributor role lets you manage Logic App but not access to them. It provides access to view, edit, and update a Logic App. Question 31. You have an Azure AD tenant named Adatum and an Azure subscription named Subscription1. Adatum contains a group named Developers. Subscription1 contains a resource group named Dev. You need to provide Developers group with the ability to create Azure Logic apps in the Dev resource group. Solution. On Subscription1, you assign the Logic App Operator role to the Developers group. Does this meet the goal? The correct answer is B. No. You would need the Logic App contributor role. Question 32. Your company has an Azure AD subscription. You want to implement an Azure AD conditional access policy. The policy must be configured to require members of the global administrators group to use multi-factor authentication and an Azure AD joint device when they connect to Azure AD from untrusted locations. Solution. You access the multi-factor authentication page to alter the settings. Does the solution meet the goal? The correct answer is B. No. The best way to enforce MFA is by conditional access. The device has to be identified by Azure AD as Azure AD joint device. The trusted IP must be configured. Question 33. Your company has an Azure AD subscription. You want to implement an Azure AD conditional access policy. The policy must be configured to require members of the global administrators group to use multi-factor authentication and an Azure AD joint device when they connect to Azure AD from untrusted sources. Solution. You access the Azure portal to alter the session control of the Azure AD conditional access policy. Does the solution meet the goal? The correct answer is B. No. No, you alter the grant control, not session control. Question 34. Your company has an Azure AD subscription. You want to implement an Azure AD conditional access policy. The policy must be configured to require members of the global administrators group to use multi-factor authentication and an Azure AD joint device when they connect to Azure AD from untrusted locations. Solution. You access the Azure portal to alter the grant control of the Azure AD conditional access policy. Does the solution meet the goal? The correct option is A. Yes. There is another copy of this question that mentions going to the MFA page in Azure portal as the solution. That is incorrect. On that page, you cannot make a conditional access policy. The answer A is correct. Instead of the MFA page mentioned above, you have to go to the route of conditional access policy, then grant control mentioned here for this question. Under grant control, you are given the option of setting MFA and requiring AD joint devices in the exact same window. Question 34. Your company makes use of multi-factor authentication for when users are not in the office. The per authentication option has been configured as the usage model. After the acquisition of a smaller business and the addition of the new staff to the Azure AD, you are informed that these employees should also make use of multi-factor authentication. To achieve this, the per enabled user setting must be set for usage model. Solution. You reconfigure the existing usage model via the Azure portal. Does the solution meet the goal? The correct answer is B. No. Since it is not possible to change the usage model of an existing provider as it is right now, you have to create a new one and reactivate your existing server with activation credentials from the new provider. Question 36. Your company's Azure solutions makes use of multi-factor authentication for when users are not in the office. The per authentication option has been configured as the usage model. After the acquisition of a smaller business and the addition of the new staff to Azure AD, you are informed that these employees should also make use of multi-factor authentication. To achieve this, the per enabled user setting must be set for the usage model. Solution. You reconfigure the existing usage model via the Azure CLI. Does the solution meet the goal? The correct answer is B. No. Since it is not possible to change the usage model of an existing provider as it is right now, you have to create a new one and reactivate your existing server with activation credentials from the new provider. Question 37. Your company's Azure solution makes use of multi-factor authentication for when users are not in the office. The per authentication option has been configured as the usage model. After the acquisition of a smaller business and the addition of the new staff to Azure AD, you are informed that these employees should also make use of multi-factor authentication. To achieve this, the per-enabled user setting must be set for the usage model. Solution. You create a new multi-factor authentication provider with a backup from the existing multi-factor authentication provider data. Does the solution meet the goal? The correct option is B. No. Effective from September 1st, 2018, new auth providers may no longer be created. Existing auth providers may continue to be used and updated, but migration is no longer possible. Multi-factor authentication will continue to be available as a feature in Azure AD premium licenses. Question 38. Your company has an Azure AD tenant named wayland.com that is configured for hybrid coexistence with the on-premises AD domain. You have a server named directorysync1 that is configured as directorysync server. You create a new user account in the on-premise Active Directory. You now need to replicate the user information to Azure AD immediately. Solution. You run the start-AD sync cycle policy type initial PowerShell cmdlet. Does this solution meet the goal? The correct answer is B. No. No initial will perform a full sync and add the user account created, but it will take time. Delta will kick off a delta sync and bring only the last change. So it will be immediately and will fulfill the requirements. Question 39. Your company has an Azure AD tenant named wayland.com that is configured for hybrid coexistence with the on-premises Active Directory domain. You have a server named directorysync1 that is configured as a directorysync server. You create a new user account in the on-premises Active Directory. You now need to replicate the user information to Azure AD immediately. Solution. You restart the net logon service on a domain controller. Does the solution meet the goal? The correct option is B. No. If you need to manually run a sync cycle, then from PowerShell run start-AD sync cycle policy type delta. To initiate a full sync cycle, run start-AD sync cycle policy type initial from a PowerShell prompt. Running a full sync cycle can be very time consuming, so if you need to replicate the user information to Azure AD immediately, then run start-AD sync cycle policy type delta. Question 40. Your company has an Azure subscription that includes a storage account, a resource group, a blob container, and a file share. A colleague named John Ross makes use of a solitary Azure Resource Manager template to deploy a virtual machine and an additional Azure storage account. You want to review the ARM template that was used by John Ross. Solution. You access the virtual machine blade. Does the solution meet the goal? The correct option is B. No. As questions talk about VM and storage account both, which can only be reviewed at RG level, you should use the resource group blade.